Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure and sort of stunned pleasure to welcome you to the fourth seminar co-run by Parapraxis and the Psychosocial Foundation. This seminar was put together by three of us: Wendy, who's here, Wendy, if you want to wave, and Zoe, who's not here today, and myself, on behalf of these two organizations. So the Psychosocial Foundation is a nonprofit educational organization that exists to advance our understanding of where the political, psychological, and social converge. And that's what we'll do together in this seminar. If you're not on our mailing list, I would at this point generally say, go visit our website and put yourself, but our website is strangely down today. So bear with us. I don't know why that is. But in general, you can see there, these annual seminars get announced, but also one-off lectures related to our theme, book events, and we also host short courses. So if you fall in love today with Klein, we have a course coming up on envy, and then also one on Freud's case studies and a few others this semester. Our seminar, which we're doing together, we'll meet every single Sunday from now through the end of March. Today, we're so unbelievably lucky to have Fakhry Davids, and we could not be more honored to learn from him again. I'll plug here that we have earlier videos with Fakhry visiting the Psychosocial Foundation and also talking about Klein that are really useful. And I'll introduce Fakhry in a minute, but first, just a quick word written by Wendy and myself separately and merged together on the overall topic of security. We are in a moment of watching the fantasy of security rupture psychosocially. From Israel's perceived loss of omnipotent security, the loss of omnipotent security in October, to a loneliness epidemic of men in the United States, and endless other social examples, security has recently been a topic of growing concern. And together we're going to study it. But first, we're going to look at how security emerges for the infant for the first few weeks. Wilfred Bion argues that one near total universal fantasy that he saw in his consulting room was that of having a twin. That in fantasy, the singleton child imagines a twin, and that twin would allow for perfect security, for a kind of understanding not provided in reality, and for the possibility of merging. And as we'll see together across this seminar, psychoanalytic theory of all of its various dogmas posits security as amongst our earliest needs, from the most basic physical gestures between care and infant, the secure hand that props up a head that cannot yet hold itself, nourishment which cannot be secured or extracted without the other, and that which must come frequently. The infant's body, and then their mind, relies completely on that of another, who slowly, as we saw today, becomes complex, becomes more fully real, and comes into view. In the maternal infant scene, security is the shape and the scope of safety. Its original availability makes its eventual withdrawal possible and tolerable, or not so tolerable, as we saw today with Klein. For Winnicott, who will read with Bion next week, this may take the form of ontological security, or its absence. Something like, in order to know we can go on being, we must first become secure in being. By another token, security, we are told, not only prefigures the quality of later attachments. We will look at attachment theory later in the seminar, but also the ability to move freely and without fear in the world. For psychoanalysts who worked on security in infancy, whether that's the work of Winnicott or the famed attachment theorist John Bowlby, psychoanalyst Renee Spitz, and many others, security wasn't just something that happened there in the past of childhood. These analysts also worked together with institutions and with the state to predict not just who might be secure later in life, but who might need to be secured by the state. The supposed child now turned delinquent because, of course, they were understood as fundamentally insecure. And yet, in the other discursive frames we'll see together, freedom of movement is precisely what security limits. The fantasy of a secure inside, the home, the population, the nation is protected from breach by enforcement limits that corroborate the existence of threat. So threading these two meanings together, which are actually deeply interrelated, our seminar is going to look at all kinds of different theories of security. And we're going to try and do so at just about every scale. So we'll start, and for those of you returning from any of our previous seminars, this will be very familiar, with classic psychoanalytic texts and approaches to the question of security. We'll then move into sociological questions of security, from child protective services to intelligence leaking. Wendy is going to present on leaks, and it'll be fantastic, ending with a third section on psychosocial understandings of security. And so just a word on the business of this seminar. You should have received a welcome email from me that has all of the readings in a Google Drive. We will meet at the same link every single week. And our format for today will be standard to all 10 weeks, where we'll hear from our presenter, Fakhry Davids, who I'll introduce in a second. We will all be invited to engage him and the text and think together. And then we will run about a total of 90 minutes or slightly longer. And just a note, please feel free to use the chat. That will help us get going in the Q&A. So with all of that out of the way, I'll never speak that long again. It was my absolute pleasure to introduce Fakhry, who will teach us about Klein and her psychoanalytic conception of security in the infant's mind. Fakhry Davids, again, from whom I've learned so much, is an honorary consultant psychologist at the London Clinic of Psychoanalysis in the UK. He runs a private practice in psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. He is the author of Internal Racism, a psychoanalytic approach to race and difference, and also the editor of Authenticity in the Psychoanalytic Encounter, the work of Irma Bremen-Pick, who passed away last year. And just again, a note that Fakhry has generously participated in these seminars several times. So I'll also drop the links to his other talks on Klein, and taken together, they're a really fabulous and I think unique introduction to Klein and the psychosocial. So Fakhry, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Hannah, you're very generous with your introduction. Thank you very much for that. It's a real pleasure to be talking to you again. I use Kleinian theory a lot. It's part of the way I think and the way I work in the consulting room. And I'm really going to talk to you from that angle, more than an abstract theoretical angle. You'll know from reading this paper that Klein is always very difficult to read. You know, she's very, very abstract. She's complicated. She doesn't, if you're used to Freud and his wonderful way of saying, now, chaps, this is what we're going to be thinking about. This is how we begin. You all know this. Now we're going to go here, and the next stop is here. Klein is just the opposite of that. You know, she throws everything in at you at the same time. So, you know, I find it not that useful to go through the papers meticulously, but rather to sit back and ask, what is she trying to get at? You know, what is the idea she's trying to convey? And mostly one can get to what the papers are about. This particular one is a difficult one. It's the 1940 paper on depression, basically, on melancholia or mourning, that whole set of topics. And today, we hardly ever take it in isolation. We always consider it alongside the 1946 paper on schizoid mechanisms. That's the classic paper where Klein sets out the theory of the paranoid schizoid position. And then, in contrast to that, the depressive position slots in very nicely. It makes you can see the whole. And essentially, the Klein's notion of inner security, to bring it back to our topic of this series, is that security comes from having a good internal object securely established in your internal world. And by securely, she means that as you navigate life, she expects you, all of us, to be buffered from side to side. She imagines that if we could see our internal world, our inner journey through life, it is quite a difficult one. We get pushed and pulled and, dragged out of alignment, out of symmetry, and that the real problem is how do we get back to something a bit more centered? Now, if we can get back to that something a little bit more centered, Klein would say that is your good object. It's your fundamental good object that you have inside of you. And she doesn't mean that you must always be in touch with your good object. She means that life does terrible things to you, and you can't insulate yourself from that. So, in a way, if you can have a bit of confidence and say, okay, let me go with this, then it indicates that you feel some sort of confidence that you won't lose your fundamental good object, that you could allow yourself to be dragged hither and thither from time to time. You can go with the flow, and then you'll struggle to get back to your center, so to speak. But that's how she imagines life to be. That, life means, I remember it was many years ago, well, when I was a child, I think, or a teenager or something, there was that film called Zorba the Greek. Do you, any of you can't remember, it's long ago, it's probably been consigned to history. But there's a wonderful line in it where he says, life is trouble, only death is not. To be alive is to wander around and look for trouble. And so he goes on. And it's that sort of attitude to life. Life means being dragged in and so on. So you can think at the moment, for example, they bomb Gaza and your bloody peace of mind is disturbed. And it's not so easy to get back to, where you were before all this stuff started. And whose idea was it? Not mine, not my idea. We weren't asked, but it's sort of just the way it is that we get dragged into things. Now, security, if you're a secure person, you can let yourself be dragged a bit in the hope or belief or expectation that you'll somehow find your way back to the center. And that's what she calls having your good object securely established in your mind. Yeah. Whereas if you're anxious about losing your good object, then you can't really so easily go with the flow. And you have to protect yourself from getting involved with life and so on. Or you may get involved in life, but then you find you're in somebody else's script, as it were. And you end up saying, well, where was I? Where you have that kind of existential problem. So for Klein, the security comes from having a sense of a good internal object. Yeah. And she means by that you then let go of it. You don't remain a prisoner to your good object, but a good object is there to support you, to help you, to give you courage when you feel frightened and so on. So I'll give you a quick example. I've got a 2.5-year-old grandson who lives with me. And his favorite game at the moment I come home from work, I have to play with him. And what do I have to play with him? I've got to go into every room, and all he wants to do is to switch off the lights. So he'll switch off the light, it'll be pitch dark. I mean, mostly it's not pitch dark. You can see a little bit of something. But he kind of gets terrified out of his wits, you know. And then when he chooses, he switches the lights on. And you can see what it's about. He's obviously afraid of the dark. The dark is full of monsters and so on, but he's learned you don't run away from your monsters. You embrace them. You try and control them. If you've got the light, you can make them go away in a second. Yeah. So he plays with this, and mostly he's not frightened at all, but every now and then he becomes terrified. It's as if he's got ahead of himself. Now that's the kind of boy, you could say, who's putting to test the idea that he can rely on his good object when he needs it. Yeah, do you follow that sort of notion? It's here. Who's afraid of monsters? Come on, man, let's go. He's that sort of attitude. And then he becomes terrified. And, sometimes he hangs in there and sometimes he has to switch it on. And it's such fun. Sometimes he wants me to be his monster. Granddad, you be the monster. Okay. And I'm very good at being a monster. So I say, okay, I'm coming now. I'm coming after you. And he is, yes, absolutely fine. And sometimes at a certain point, he becomes absolutely terrified. You can tell I've become a monster, literally, in his inner perception. He's gone a little bit too far and he climbs into my wife and seeks refuge concretely in a good object, rather than being able to, in his mind, take refuge to that. Do you see that kind of stuff? That's what Klein sort of means, that we all know that if we have a good object, we can face all sorts of things. But sometimes we face the terror of losing it, and that we're then exposed to our bad objects, to our monsters, and so on. So that's the sort of notion of how Klein thinks of security and well-being. And if you've got this thing so deeply established in yourself, I mean, we all have that, don't we? Sometimes it's pitch dark and you do get frightened, or you walk down a street that you think is a dangerous place. And sometimes you've got to tell yourself, no, hang on a minute, this is only in my head. It's actually an all right place. So you're there in danger of losing your inner attachment to your good object. So you've got to do something or other to fix it. Yeah. So, for example, when you tell yourself the story, it is only this street. I'm only frightened because I've been told that this side of town is a dangerous side of town, and so on. When you tell yourself that narrative, you give an explanation as to why you're afraid, and you're reassuring yourself that it's not because you've lost your good object. Yeah, you'll be okay is the end of that kind of dealing with. So that, in a nutshell, is Klein's notion of where security comes from. Shall I pause for a minute, or shall I go straight on? Anybody want to chip in? I do want you to feel absolutely free to have a seminar, because to talk, because that way, one sort of realizes what needs maybe a bit further consideration. So don't hold back. Shall I go on? Okay, so
I think so, yeah.
okay, somebody said something, Sarah Sanchez like said something in there. Can you speak more about what introjection means? Okay, let's go straight there. Okay. Now, the what I'm talking about so far is, of course, that somehow we've, from experiences with the world, we've finished up with something inside our heads. So the simplest way to think of that is that something has been introjected from the outside to the inside. And in this paper, Klein talks a lot, and sometimes annoyingly, about the internal object and the external object. But that's what she means, that none of us would be here today if we didn't have something like a mother, real, actual, three-dimensional, other kind of figure, a real person. We would not be here. Now, mostly that's a mother. It doesn't have to be a mother, of course, as you can tell. It needs to be another human being who does the functions associated with a mother that we normally associate with a mother. That's why I put it like that. Now, that's where we all start, that we have a real external object who's looking after us. And in the beginning, that person is usually willing to absolutely prioritize us because we are so miserable and helpless. We can't do a single thing for ourselves. We don't know what's wrong with us. You know, we know nothing from nothing, as it were. And that person usually will take that into account and say, I can't even ask this child to alert me. I can't take for granted that this baby will alert me when there's something wrong with them. I'm going to have to hope they do, but just in case they don't, I'm going to have to be keeping my eyes and ears and everything else open. So we begin with an external object. And then that external figure, obviously, by the time my grandson is 2.5, you can see, obviously, he's got it inside of him. So the process by which the external object is taken in is usually what we call introjection. Now, I'll say something in a minute about how that happens, okay? Because that Klein has got a whole story about it. But is it Jasmine wanted to ask something or say something?
Oh
Go
yeah,
ahead.
I'm curious about the dimension of kind of getting back to an inner object, or like the kind of developmental dimension of fundamentally starting with an introjected object. Do you think in a kind of temporal sense then security always has to do with some kind of like hindsight or regression or nostalgia or something like that? Like this kind of sense of getting back?
Yeah. Klein thinks that. Absolutely. It has to do with, that's why Klein thinks of your first object. Your first object is the mother. What that means is the person who does the stuff I've just talked about will clean you, will keep an ear open for you, will think for you, will figure things out for you, will feed you, will keep you warm, all that stuff. That's thought of as the first object that is associated with that, and we call it conventionally a mother. So that's the thing. And then for your psychic health, not for your this first thing you need for your physical survival, and your psychic health is grafted on top of it. Yeah. For your psychic health, your mental health, you also need another object, the third object. Yeah. Not the person who is responsible for all of that, but another kind of figure that by virtue of bringing something different into play brings three-dimensionality or depth into your world. Yeah? So that's the function of the third. So if you think of it as a father, that's the sort of figure one's thinking of. And when Klein talks in this paper, she talks about the attacks on the parental couple. She's meaning something that involves both the couple together, not one in as opposed to the other. Yeah? So that's that. Now, Ryan, you wanted to bring something in?
Yeah. So as I said in the chat, you mentioned the idea that the ability to be dragged away from the internal object is healthy, but also it's unhealthy to get too involved in other people's scripts. So where is the difference there? Is it the fact that there's a secure base and you know you can come back from
Yeah,
being in other people's scripts?
yeah.
Or is there more subtle
Yeah,
something?
no, absolutely. That's what I had in mind. That it's all very well to get involved with the world, but if your whole self is getting dragged into it, and then you get lost in your object, and you don't have a sense of your center, this is me, and that gives different can give rise to many different anxieties. So that is what I was talking about. Let me try and pick up the theme of introjection, because that's what how do objects come to be inside? Klein's theory is like this. She says, how does an infant know about taking things in? And she says, well, if you feed a baby and it takes things in through its mouth, and stuff that was outside then disappears, and it seems to connect to produce something warm, say, usually a sensation of like that. That is a model for taking things in from the world into myself. Yeah. So her theory is that the baby does something like that mentally. Yeah? Mentally, psychically, it swallows the mother. It thinks, oh, here is a very I don't mean mother as you and I would look at the picture of the mother. Klein doesn't mean that. She means the whole experience the baby's had of this 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 good interchange. My bum was dirty and it was uncomfortable and it was hurting me. And the next moment, a few things happened, and suddenly, normal services resumed. That's great. Yeah. That's what Klein thinks is the experience of a good object. And the baby, once it twigs that that's different from the more painful experiences, it says, well, can't I take that in the way I take the milk in? And then it takes the mother in. It swallows something or other that Klein calls that is a good object. Do you follow? It's that experience that the baby wants to have inside of it and to keep hold of. So introjection is a sort of notion of just swallowing something. Just, you swallow it whole and then it's inside of you as if by magic. So the first internalization is an omnipotent internalization. Yeah. So the baby is going to believe it has something good inside of it because it's telling you that's what's happened. It's taken it in. And because it feels nice inside of its insides, it knows it's got it inside. Do you see? That's the way internalization works in infancy on the model of feeding. You take it in, and then it's in there. And when it feels like it's in there, you know it's in there. That's Klein's theory of in the beginning. You just introject your object, just take it in. And usually that would be the good objects. Now, what happens when colic, say, strikes, and instead of the milk producing nice sensations and you believe you're in seventh heaven, instead of having that sort of experience, suddenly things are getting hold of your guts, twisting them inside out. If that's what colic does, if you see, and you don't know how to make yourself comfortable, you twist and turn yourself. The more you do, the more you scream because the more painful it is. So when you've got that, the baby realizes that this is not that other thing that happened, where what we would call a good object came inside of me. So the not good object gets a kind of name. We don't know what the baby calls it, but we call it a bad object. Why? Because it's not calm and, serene and so on when it comes in, but it's persecuted. Something's grabbed hold of its guts and twisting it inside out like that. That's what colic does to babies. Yeah. And similarly, if it's taken in something noxious or whatever. So Klein thinks that with these two sets of experience, the baby has a kind of distinction of sorts between what she will call a good object and a bad object. And once you can make that distinction, she reckons you're on this out of the starting blocks of life, then you're in business. Because if you've got a good object, you can sort of say, you know what, guys, I'd like a bit more of that. And if you've got an awful object, you can say, listen, guys, take that away, please. Take that somewhere else. Don't bring that anywhere near me. Yeah. And that's the notion of splitting your objects. So Klein thinks there's something a bit like that happens early. Now, I'm sorry, that's not in the reading for today. That's in the 1946 paper, but it's so fundamental to the way one thinks. I had to just give you a potted version of that. But that's how introjection happens. And you can see then, if the baby is saying, listen, for God's sake, guys, take this stuff out of me and get it away from me, then you're talking projection, isn't it? And why do we think a baby might be able to manage that kind of thing in its head? Because in addition to taking things in, the baby also projects things out. Vomit, wind that is really persecutory. You know, for babies, small babies, it's a very, very big deal to pass wind, to get it out. And the relief is palpable when you can. So Klein basically thinks that you use that model as an infant of your experience to develop a notion that you can use your head to project things. And then you can see if you've got a good object and a bad object, that is good experience, bad experience, then obviously it's a no-brainer. Get rid of the bad stuff and keep hold of the good stuff. So that's her picture of early development. That's the baby's developmental task, now, and you can see, what does that do? That makes it possible for the baby to have a rudimentary early experience of having a good object. Yeah, you've got something good that you feel that you're holding on to. You've taken it in and you're holding on to it inside of you. So that sort of experience, she reckons, is what your first few months of life is about.
We have a few questions in the chat. I think one of them that just came in, I do want to honor the order, but this question just came in about the difference between introjection and internalization, which seems to be maybe also one place where Klein departs from her reading of Freud, or has a slightly different interpretation that she establishes on, what page is it? I think it's page 113. So could you talk a bit about the difference between introjection and internalization, and maybe how Klein departs from Freud?
Yeah, absolutely. Klein thinks differently. And that's because she's got a theory of early infantile taking in that is reasonable, and it's coherent. I mean, as I spoke to you about it, the notion is, why should we think an infant can do that? You see, she answers that. We think an infant, not perhaps right at the beginning, but pretty soon, should have a template for doing the sorts of things that she says it can do. And that's different. Now, Freud didn't go that far back, and he didn't theorize early infancy fully. And if you were to ask Klein, she would say, well, if Dr. Freud had done that, he would have found what I found. And of course, many other people dispute that, but that's Klein's story. If you looked and observed carefully, you would. Now, why does she say that? Because from Freud, what we learned is you can look at adults, and from that you can infer what obtained in the child mind of that person. And she says, and therefore, if I look at a 2.5-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, I think by the same logic, I can see in there what may have obtained in the child, in the infant, in this person. So that's her logic, and it is at least coherent. Yeah. Now, in terms of the business with internalization, to introject, to swallow whole, obviously is not a satisfactory way of that. It's a way that you use when you know no better. The infant doesn't know the world. It doesn't know what a mother is. It doesn't know what a human being is. It doesn't know what, it has very rudimentary experience. So Klein says that what has to happen is that this swallowed whole kind of introject has to be transformed in the mind into something that better approximates the external object, better approximates what's there in reality. So the work of internalization, as Klein understands it, involves this kind of, you could say, she talks in this paper about reality testing, doesn't she? And she refers to Freud. In other words, for the beginning, it'll do for an infant to have some notion that something is good and that it wants to hold on to, and that's just fine. For the beginning, it will work. But pretty soon, it's going to have to modify those pictures so she can discriminate between what is genuinely a good external object and what is genuinely a bad external object. The early one is very much based on this person gives me good sensations, and that's what makes it good. This one gives me bad sensations, and that's what makes it bad. So you've got to make that transition. And in this paper, she talks about the depressive position quite a lot. And in her version of it, the depressive position is when the baby begins for the first time to put things together in a way that is more consistent with reality. I'll give you a quick example of that, just for to get the concept across. Okay, but let's hear what Guy wanted to say. Shall we?
Hi, thank you. I was curious about this distinction between internal and external that seems to be there from the start in the Kleinian metapsychology. And I wondered what you think about that, if that is really there from the start, or if it's something that we could also subject to analysis.
Yeah, no, it's not there from the start. That distinction. It's you have to bear in mind when you and I talk about it, that's we are speaking from an observer's perspective. From the observer's perspective, the object is external to the infant sometimes, and at other times we think the object is internal. Yeah. So when the baby is in connection with somebody and it experiences something, we'll say that's directly with the external object. When it's lying there, say, and is gripped by something good or awful, we say that's the internal object. As Freud said, when it's sucking, that you can observe very young infants, that baby is, he called it, in hallucinatory wish fulfillment. In other words, psychically, it is sucking at the breast, but in reality, there's no breast that's sucking at, if you see what I mean. Yeah. So that distinction is very, very important. What obtains in the baby's mind and what obtains in the observer's mind. And that's a general criticism also of Klein in the way she writes. Often she doesn't make it clear enough which she's talking about, and you've kind of got to struggle a bit and to figure out which one she has in mind, our perspective or the infant's own perspective. From the baby's perspective, in the beginning, we assume there's no distinction between internal and external. A sensation might as well, in the very beginning, come from inside as come from outside. Yeah? If you put a finger on there and stroke it, it'll respond to you as if it's internal sometimes. This sort of thing. So very early on, though, Klein thinks the baby becomes alert and attuned to what's outside. Doesn't take that long. So, it depends a bit on when you're asking, when your question is about. Is that helpful? Yeah. Okay, so let's get back to the other narrative. We're trying to think about how does it happen? How does internalization happen? So you can see internalization doesn't mean taking in. It's a misleading concept. It's how do I bring my internal picture of my object in line with the external one, with external reality? That's the question. And external reality, just to go back to what Guy was just saying, is external reality from the observer's point of view. Yeah, that how do you get it closer to that? Klein thinks what happens is that for quite a bit, 6 months, she thinks, you tend to keep these two figures separate. Now if you take just a silly example, if you say that the baby learns that its mother is a very good figure, yeah, that necessitates, according to Klein, for the baby to recruit somebody else into the possession of a bad object. Do you follow why? Because if you make the mother the bad object too, then that produces a kind of psychotic confusion. The baby's ego can't handle it. Yeah, it knows only one experience. So in the beginning, you need somebody, if you can have somebody different other than the mother, who can temporarily be recruited to the role of the bad object, then you can consolidate your good experience. That means you can get to know more about the feed, where, when does it happen, under what circumstances. You can develop hypotheses that if I cry like this, I'll get it. If I cry like that, if I bite my mother's nipples, it'll get withdrawn quickly. That's what she means by consolidating the good object. That is, you get to know much more about this good object, and that learning, because it helps you to understand your external object in reality. It's more reality attuned, and it gives you a sense also of getting to know your object. If you know your object, it means that you can maybe trust it more than if it were just some random thing that happened to waft across your life. So that's the kind of theory as to how it works. Do you sort of, are you with me?
Yes, there's a question in the chat that might be helpful to pause over here, which I'll paraphrase briefly, but that Klein seems very focused and prescriptive for normal and normative development here, that she has a kind of progression narrative. And what would happen in the Kleinian sense for someone who's never able as an infant to have a sufficient stable object, good internal object, or had their sense consistently disrupted? How would that influence the work of the going back to the good object?
So that's a very good question, isn't it? What are the external circumstances that promote and are consistent with developing a good internal object? Okay, so it's a very good question. In the so-called normative circumstances, where there's a baby who's got a mother that's more or less reliably there, you can see how it would work. Now, what if the mother isn't that reliably available? What if care isn't that reliably available? The long and short is that all of that is subject to what one can investigate, becomes an interesting question. But the theory is that unless you manage to consolidate an internal object, you're going to struggle with life and have difficulties. Okay, so that is fundamental to Klein, the consolidation of your good object. If you can't keep the good object separate from the bad, remember I said in the beginning there's a split, a division between them. Get rid of the bad, you keep them out. If you fail to keep them out, then you'll become paranoid, because the badness, by definition, should, in normal development, for good, healthy development, should be able to shut the door on it. You all know, you know that story. You all know that. Sometimes life gets a bit too much for us, doesn't it? We may not consciously say, look, I'm going to go mad if I keep having to face this. But the ability to shut the door and to leave what you can't manage outside is central to mental health. You know, otherwise, the horrible stuff marches in, persecutes you, breaks you down. So that's really quite important, to be able to protect your good object inside of you. In the beginning, okay, let me give you a moment just to take that in. Nika?
Sorry, I don't know how to articulate this exactly, but so it seems like you're speaking to some kind of like a duality, right? Like the good and bad. I'm curious, like, when do we, what about feelings of like mixed feeling? Like, is there a good and bad?
In the beginning, there's no mixed feeling. If there's mixed feeling, you end up with a psychotic confusion where you can't tell your good from your bad in the very beginning. So what I said earlier about the observer's point of view and the infant's point of view is really important, because from your and my point of view, good and bad experience exists for any baby right from the beginning. You know, they get gratified, they feel content, and they feel persecuted when things are wrong because they don't yet have what we have. You know, we understand something of what's wrong. If you don't have that, then it's just persecution coming at you. So in the beginning, from the observer's point of view, there is good and bad experience. But from the infant's point of view, at any one time, there is only one. It is either content, in which case it has always been content and always will be content, or it is in hell's place, you know, in which case it's always been like that, and it'll scream as if that will never end. If you listen to it, because it doesn't yet have a notion like what you're talking about. What you're talking about, both, is a developmental achievement. And that takes us on to the depressive position, because Klein calls the moment when the baby can begin to realize that it's not the way I thought it was. That's the moment that she says you're entering the depressive position. Depressive position means that you suddenly realize that, firstly, that you've demonized one object. You know, every time I hurt, I think it's this guy called my father who's done it to me. And through the course of life, you begin to put, you know, memory develops more, can concentrate, all these capacities develop. So they say through maturation, you begin to realize that you've been a bit unfair to the person that you think of as a bad object. That's the way it comes first. Yeah. Now, Klein says that Freud's idea, you remember the castration anxiety that the boy supposedly feels and so on. Klein says that that's probably connected with a very, very early notion that this third object is going to get me because, not because I have a penis, but because I have projected nastiness into his penis, whilst at the same time safeguarding niceness and goodness that I've projected into the breast and the nipple. Do you follow that way of thinking? So there's an early problem that the baby's trying to solve there, which is that in reality, its concept of its bad object is not true. You know, people are people. You may have a dad who's got a gruff voice and a mother who's got a fine voice. But that doesn't mean that your mother is universally good and your father is universally bad. Depressive position is where the penny begins to drop. Yeah? And then she's got a story about that. She says, now, in order to fix this, you got to somehow realize that you are responsible for having turned your father. I'm calling it now just father for ease. Yeah, you've turned your father into a devil and your mother into an angel, whereas your mother is a good person mostly because her job is that she feeds you and she cares for you. And your father sometimes also is good to you. So it's experiential and so on. And that's the beginning of internalizing the actual reality of what your objects are like. That requires work. Klein has a theory about it. She says that if you listen to the kind of cries you get from a baby at about 8 months or so, 7, 8 months, 6, 7, 8 months, thereabouts, she says they become different to what the cries you hear early on. Early on, the cries are screams that everything is wrong with me and, somebody had better fix it, they paranoid cries. But it changes to something a bit more whiny, a bit different. And Klein jumps in straight away and says, you see, there's something different going on in that baby's head. There's some kind of sense of what later we'll call remorse or guilt or whatever. And in theory, she says, that's where the baby's realizing that it's done a terrible damage to its bad object. Yeah, and that it had better fix that if it doesn't want to keep living in fantasy, but values taking a step into reality. Do you see? So that your picture of the internal object begins to resemble more what you and I as observers will see. More that than just this black-white split of the earlier time. So you see that Klein has a specific theory as to how you get from what we called in the beginning an introject. An introject you can just swallow and then it's in there. And how you turn that into an internal version of the object connected with that, the external object. That's what you will call internalization. So great big psychic work happening in the mind of a 6-month-old, according to Melanie Klein. But that's where it is. And you remember from the paper, she says many times that when you are depressed, when you face loss, it's this stuff that's at the core of you that gets reworked. It gets revived. And then you've got to deal with it again and again and again. And you can see the point of that is that every time you deal with it, you deal with it a bit better because, you've had another go, you're slightly older, and so on. So that's her picture of how the depressive position plays itself out throughout your life. And it's vital because without that work, we won't be able to relate to reality. Yeah, Remember, in the paranoid schizoid world, good or bad, is totally influenced by fantasy. Yeah. And by a partial picture of reality. This person holds me nicely. Therefore, she keeps me alive. She's my good figure. Everyone else don't need them. It's totally fantasy dominated.
Fakhry, can I ask a question off of that? So one thing that Klein does in the paper we did read for today is what you say, and I actually find it really moving that it's a move she likes to do, where she's taking the infant from the point of view of the infant and then showing us the clinical material of the adult whose son has died, of the man who has persecutory and hateful feelings towards both her and the mother father, etc. And as a side note, the dreams in this essay are incredible. I just the dreams, especially from the mother facing loss. And so we see, of course, how Klein's normative infant grows up, including when there's trouble. But I was wondering if you could speak to, the difficult work of how this scales. One thing that we've been thinking about in the last seminar and in general at Parapraxis is these kinds of intimate theories of individuals or dyads and how they scale up. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts about how to think Klein's secure and insecure infant psychosocially or at scale.
Let's discuss it a bit, shall we?
Please.
I'm a clinician, so I don't have a ready answer for you on that, but I'd love to think about it, how to scale it up. But firstly, your point about the case material, it's very important actually, because mostly we think about depression as the kind of, the pain of loss, the pain of depression. But you'll know from this paper that she says it's not just pain, it's not just loss, it's also hatred she brings in. She brings in persecution, she brings in mania. So there's a whole gamut of stuff and that's the importance of the paper, that she brings into the mix, that she says is part of depression. Now, you'll remember Freud did a little bit of that. He opened that up. You remember where he's in his Mourning and Melancholia paper, where he says that all of us, when we lose somebody, it's a shock to the system. We are stunned by the pain of loss. We almost can't bear it. It's though sometimes I like to think it's as though somebody's just chopped an arm off and, without anesthetic and walked away with it. That loss psychically at the deepest layers is something like that. And she, of course, tunes in very much with that. There's the pain of loss, but then she says there's also the anger and the hatred that goes with it. And sometimes we can't bear the hatred. So what we do is we erect defenses against the hatred. And mania is one defense, where you just transport yourself above it so that you're not in touch with it at all. The other defense she talks about in here is obsessionality. She thinks that's a more normal defense. Do you remember? Mrs. A loses her son and she starts folding the clothes. Yeah. And she says very movingly, as you say, Hannah, that what she's doing there is that the clothes stand for the internal son, the son who is threatened with death, that she is bestowing loving care on, and partly that is to restore it, and partly it is to control all the gamut of feelings that belong to experiencing loss. And today we think of those as the two, you know, the pain of loss that is absolutely unbearable, you know, where you feel, I've lost, you know, people say, I've lost my life, I'm dead, I'm finished, you know, that kind of sense, the pain of loss. And then, you know, what comes shortly after that, as who the hell's idea was this? You know, that's the rage that Freud identified is turned against the mourner. Remember? He said that you have rage against the object for leaving you. And what sort of nonsense is that? You feel rage and hatred towards an object you love and that you're hoping to keep inside of you and so on. You know, so that gets turned into the kind of relentless self-reproach and so on. You remember, that's just straight mourning and melancholia taken from Freud. So Klein adds to that there are whole, if you open it up, because she makes it early, then you find all the messiness of early psychic life. Yeah? For example, mania, she talks about triumph. You remember that? It's in the A case, you know, where Mrs. A loses her son. Yeah? And in the analysis, that is connected in association to something that happened between her brother and a tutor. Brother, much admired, all of that sort of stuff, much loved, and the tutor. And Klein unravels it and unpicks it and says, that's not so easy, that when this brother slipped and struggled rather than flying through his academic achievements, he slipped, stumbled, fell, needed to be helped by this tutor. At that moment, Mrs. A, as a child, felt triumphant over him. Yeah, delighted. Here's this big brother, always the one I had to look up to, always flying, always miles ahead. There he is in the gutter. Yeah, feeling of triumph that she has over her brother, that she connects with triumph that is felt over the son, unconscious triumph that's felt over the son, transferred from the brother onto the son, and makes it impossible for her to mourn him. Yeah, to remember, she says she couldn't cry, she couldn't dream, everything was frozen. So that's sort of very typical psychoanalytic ways of working, where you sort of unpick that and figure it all out. Why can't she cry? Some starts always with a simple question. She lost her baby, her son, and she can't cry. What's going on? You see, and Klein shows you in this that it's not the grown-up woman and her relationship with her son that's stirred up by this act, this event. It is her relationship with her brother, who lost his capacity to be perfect as a student, that she triumphed over him. That is, in that moment, all her hatred and resentment towards the big brother came forward. Yeah? And the death then allows you to make a hypothesis that Mrs. A, at whatever it was, 6, 7, wished her brother dead because he was so bloody smart, so bloody big, so everything. Yeah? Something that Mrs. A never knew, didn't know as a child, and so on. Now, the hypothesis is if you go there and analyze all of that, she'll be able to cry and mourn her son. That's how psychoanalysis works. But that, I agree with you, it's very moving, isn't it? Trying to take seriously a simple observation, namely, she can't cry. What's going on?
Go ahead, Jasmine.
Yeah, just to speak to your question, Hannah, and I put this in the chat before, but I couldn't help thinking about in this whole idea of like getting back to a good inner object, that there's some feeling of connection there with nationalistic movements that harken back to a mythologized past, whiteness or unity, or there's some tugging towards something that's mythologized in the past.
Mm.
Maybe that's some idea about how this could scale up.
No, absolutely. I think I would certainly agree with you. I think most psychoanalysts probably would agree with you, mainly because if you observe it, it's so stubborn and it's so resistant to reality. It's so, you can reason with people till cows kind of come home, but if they've got this sort of delusional thing in their heads, there's nothing you can do about it. So that's what makes you think it must be to do with plugging into this simplistic way of dealing with things. But that's another story, because my work on internal racism is relevant to that, because what we're talking in this seminar, what we're talking about is sort of Klein's notion that inside a mourning that we face today, you will find hidden our childhood and infantile version of something. Yeah. So we're trying to emphasize that directly. I think in things like racism, it's not that. It's not a direct regression. I think there is something malignant that puts out a kind of propaganda. Firstly, generates primitive anxiety, and then puts out a propaganda that the only way to deal with this is to stick together as a group. Yeah, us versus them. So it's a slightly different way. It develops the notion of splitting, but in a particular way. Do you follow roughly what I'm saying, or am I just talking to myself? I mean, it's always the difficulty if you think you know what you're talking about and you just drop it in.
Dorsey, go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering, like, going back to the clinical section of this essay, if you could speak a bit to Klein's description of like her own clinical practice and maybe how that relates to like your work as a clinician. I think I was just kind of struck by like in her description, like sort of the density of interpretations she's making. I don't know, does that make sense?
I'm on a bad wicket there, because I don't think we work the way Klein does anymore. She was extraordinary in the sense that she had a conviction about what she saw, and she was very brave as a clinician. And when it came off, it was spectacular. Some of her cases, Hannah, you must get people to read the little Dick case sometimes. Just remarkable, a case that would sort of flummox most of us, child who doesn't reach out, nothing seems to get through, and all of that. And Klein's got a hypothesis as to what's going on here. And that is that it's not that this child is not connected with the world, but it's that he's got a kind of splitting, he splits it off so that he's completely cut off from the connection. So it's a very interesting notion that there is a connection there. And then the question becomes, well, how could I link up with that clinically? And she comes up with an ingenious hypothesis about, that this is to do with an attack on the parental intercourse. She doesn't put it like that in the paper, but that's her hypothesis. And so she thinks, well, how do I talk to I think is it a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old? How do I talk to a 4-year-old about that? And she thinks, well, I can't do that, can I? But I can play with him. So what she does And she says, I'm going to tell him, here's a mummy train and a daddy train, right? Because I think it's to do with a relationship between, and a dick train between the three of them. And he sticks them down there, and hey presto, Dick does something or other, moves this train into the station or something. And Klein says, hallelujah, something's happening here. You know, I, in the outside world that normally doesn't penetrate him at all, I've said to him, there are these three trains, and look, what I've said to him as a response. So I got to meet him. So she comes up with an interpretation as to what's happened there. And every time she does, there's a further response from him. So that's the way she used to work, you know, very direct and so on. Today, we don't work like that anymore because we don't have to prove that it is possible. You know, when somebody's totally cut off, it's possible to try and find a way to reach inside. You know, that's been done. Now we can do it in a way that's a bit more egocentric, we think, a bit gentler and a bit, you know, in a different, a slower way. I was going to say more creative, but in a way you can't be more creative than somebody who dreams up that kind of madness that she has in that paper. It's somebody asked about Lacan. Lacan read that paper, and he went completely apoplectic. You know, he said Mrs. Klein forced reality down the throat of this poor child. Now you remember, Lacan was very interested in the psychotic layer of things and not forcing reality, but going anyway. So that was controversial also. But the technique today, we would use it, I think, in a more compassionate way. You know, we'd be more inclined to say to a patient, I think you're terrified of losing me, you know, in your mind. You know, or losing the me in your mind. And that's why you're hanging on to it so desperately. See, that's the way today we use Klein's insights. Or we say when somebody's very obsessional, we may say, should we interpret, name the obsessionality, or should we say, if we're right and that's a defense, then containing, naming the anxiety that lies beneath it, that should make the defense go away. So we're more likely to try and figure that out. You're afraid that if you stop being so controlling, that you will find that you've lost your sense of inner goodness. Or you'd say, you'll find that you've lost really your connection with me. Or you'll find that really beneath the surface, I have turned against you. You see, we find that kind of way of tuning in to the anxieties. So that's how we use Klein today. Not exactly the way she does in her writings.
Thank you. Tulika, if you want to go next.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks, Fakhry. I was really interested in your comment about internalized racism, and when you talked about certain mournings being about a hidden childhood mourning, whereas racism is a little bit different. And I was just wondering whether it's different in the sense that racism is about a group, it's about the social, or whether it's, but then of course the social kind of permeates the individual to the core. So intrapsychically, how does that relate to racism? I'm just finding it difficult to think about it intrapsychically and socially at the same time.
So intrapsychically, if you think about how racism works, you know, let's say Donald Trump gets into power again. I should immediately repent such an idea, just in case. Anyhow, but you know, the mechanism is about having a nominated bad object that is supposed to be the responsible for all your ills, and if you sort that out, control that object, keep them out, and so on, then everything will be miraculously fixed. That's at the core of it, and that is a paranoid schizoid way of thinking. Now, the trouble is, nobody, if you were to say that to a racist, they would argue endlessly with you about it. You can't get a meeting of minds on this. So that what you've got, instead of one defense, you know, somebody saying just, oh, don't talk rubbish, or you know, whatever it is, you've got a whole string of things which are mobilized arguments to keep you busy. So that's what I think is a defensive organization, not one defense, but a whole cunning plan to proceed with what you're doing and not have it questioned, something like that. Now, where is the insecurity? See, if you ask, well, what is that policy for? What is it meant to achieve? You've got a real problem, because that policy is completely based on demonizing another and controlling them. And that's got to be made to become self-fulfilling. So it goes on and on and on, and one never asks, what is this for? And is it the best way to deal with it? So that's what I think goes on in racism. There is an anxiety, but that anxiety is in the political world, it is milked for political end. For Trump, it has benefit to him. So it's not, to my mind, 100% genuine anxiety. There is some anxiety in it, but it's manipulated and used in the service of something else. And that's what makes it difficult. Because if you talk only about the latter, the use to which it's put, then you are felt to miss people's real anxiety. If you talk about the anxiety, you are felt to miss the manipulativeness that goes with this kind of organized defenses. I don't know if that helps at all.
That was great. We have a couple of questions in the chat, but I have one question that I want to add to the end of the answer that you just provided, which is kind of reduces the depressive and paranoid positions a little bit into a schema. But I'm wondering whether, to the extent that you said that, to move past the depressive position, and one should be able to keep the badness out, otherwise you develop paranoia. And I'm wondering if the depressive position and the paranoid position, which obviously I know less about, having not read that paper that you mentioned, but I'm wondering if they're differently oriented toward the political in a way, such that, the paranoid position actually lets the outside in, maybe excessively and at the cost of individual normative mental health, but how I guess in the adult, and maybe it always is related back to the infant, but how one might actually try to move between these positions in order to become a political subject or something like that.
Very interesting point. What do you think, Wendy?
Well, I'm going to present on paranoia later and on Chelsea Manning. So I'm thinking a lot about how paranoia actually might open itself onto some sort of political position. But I was really just curious what you think. So I guess we're throwing the ball back and forth here. But
Yeah, I tell you, the one thing that occurs to me is that the external world is a place where paranoid mechanisms are much more easily mobilized. You know, it's easy. So, for instance, if you talk about racism, it's very hard in a group because people immediately feel wrong-footed. They feel accused. They feel there's that the space for reflection, thought, all of that just suddenly, closes down, so that you're in the midst of a paranoid setup. And that's one of the difficulties with working in the world outside. The depressive position is one that requires, by definition, a little bit more reflection, doesn't it? It starts with one saying, I mean, we sort of picture the infant saying, hang on a minute, was that right? Was that entirely right? You need a bit of that kind of hang on a minute kind of moment, and if you're in the middle of making an argument against somebody, or if you're in the middle of a campaign of one sort or other, it's very difficult to get to a depressive position kind of space. Now, one could learn from that. One could say, well, if that's generally true, then it's nonetheless maybe helpful to make room for it, to see if one can think things over a bit, if one can withdraw a little bit from the polarized situation. So that's sort of one thought about the external world in relation to all of this. I mean, you'll see that Klein talks about the dreams in the depressive position. So there's a bit more kind of internal processing coming along. And, many writers think about that as a triangular, a space opens up inside. So that if you're in a paranoid mindset, it's like that, isn't it? You're at daggers drawn, and it's very straightforward and simple. The other involves opening up a space like that. So people tend to think it's associated with letting in at least another angle. Yeah. And when you're sort of when you're in that territory, then you are letting in more sort of the reflective thoughts, the second thoughts, the third thoughts. And people think that that's more connected with reality, makes room for reality, rather than just, this is what I feel. If it's just what I feel, that's straightforward. And now, sometimes people think that this is an anti-activist stance, because you could see that it may help you to mobilize if you're in a paranoid position, get really worked up. But if you remain there, then your strategic thinking is going to be compromised. It'll be based on, doing what in the moment will bring pleasure or discharge or whatever, rather than thinking as strategic beings. What do we want to achieve? What can we achieve? Which battles do we want to take on? And for that, you need to move beyond just, the polarizations that animate you.
Thank you. And I think that also, Jasmine has a note in the chat that the question of letting too much reality in is also bad for organizing, in the sense of burnout, crisis, compassion fatigue, etc. David, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. I was wondering.
Sorry, let's just, Wendy, in relation to that, I agree with that. It's a very important point. we mustn't think that there isn't a use for the paranoid schizoid position, or that it's only a stepping stone. It's very good sometimes to be able to say, no, enough. I don't want to take that in. At this moment, I'm focusing on this. This is where I want to be, as long as you don't sort of forget about it. Like, forgetting about it is pure paranoid schizoid position. It's consigned to Mars. Whereas to use those mechanisms in the interest of what you're trying to achieve is very, very important. You get support, you mobilize, you can think, it's really important. Sorry, David.
Sure, just a quick question. Like, how do you think we as clinicians, or how have you dealt working with clients who express bigotry, racist thoughts, hate right in the room, and how do from my own experiences, it feels very tricky to both maintain your own right, not like maintaining one's own point of view while figuring out how to relate to that part of the client who doesn't necessarily want a political debate, yet not losing your own sense of self in that dialogue. So just sort of curious about that.
It's very, very difficult to do that, but it's important. I mean, I think, if I have a bigot, I don't want to differ from the bigot. I want that bigotry to change in the course of the work that I do. And for the long-term possibility, I'm willing to do it through proper analytic principles. So for instance, I say to myself, here is somebody who is saying something that is so vile, so unacceptable to me. But I've got to remember that this is their space. According to Freud, the first rule is say here what is on your mind. So first, if I follow the first rule, I've got to find the resource to tolerate that, not to agree with it, not to condone it, not to do also, but just to be able to tolerate it. And I find that very, very hard. I in my heart, I hate people's bigotry, and my gut impulse is to get up there and give them 2 smacks around the cheeks and say, how bloody dare you, That's my gut instinct. And I find that knowing that that's my reaction to it helps me sometimes. I keep quiet if I have nothing to say, and if my patient then comments on the fact that I keep quiet, then of course we've got a way forward, don't we? Because I could then say to the patient, it looks as if my silence has made you uncomfortable. So then we can think about the projected discomfort into me that flows from this horrible thing that is just articulated. You see? So I try to slow it down. I try to know. I think it's fatal to deny your own feelings and to try and be nice. I don't try and be nice to patients when they're awful. But I do try to act in a professional way, to say, okay, I'm not going to tell you off for your thing. And if the patient then says, I think you hate me for what I've just said, then we're in business. Because that I can interpret as guilt inside of my patient about that awfulness that's come out of his mouth, which is disavowed and projected into me. You see, so that one can take it one step at a time, but it really is hard. It was my nightmare. I'm from South Africa originally, And it was my absolutely nightmare. What if what walks in through this door is, one of the architects of apartheid? What on earth am I going to do? And I sort of knew what I had to do. Whether I could do it, I didn't know. But, one also, sometimes one can't do certain things. And it's, so what I'm saying, it's a delicate matter, as to what you can do, but it is clear what we should do, isn't it? Your space is your space. You must say what's in your mind, but I have an obligation to fashion some response to that. And it's got to be a professional response about what goes on in your mind, not whether I like it or don't like it or approve of it or don't approve of it. Do you see? So that's how I try to orientate myself with it. It's been very hard with the Gaza war, really hard. I was talking to Hannah about this a while ago. Really, really, really hard. But so far, we're still in there, trying to do what we do. And I'm hopeful that the things that I find objectionable will not just be personally objectionable to me, but aspects of the patient that require attention. That so.
Thank you so much, Fakhry. I think we'll end there and save the chat. There's a lot that has come up that we can continue into the next session, which where we'll have a presentation by Hannah Zevin herself. So we'll be reading Beyond and Winnicott on the holding environment and the container and the contained. So those are on the Google Drive right now. The website is currently down, but it should be back up tomorrow, and we'll send around a reminder with the Zoom link and the readings, but they're all at the same Google Drive link that you should have from the email. Thank you everyone so much for coming and spending some of your Sunday together, and thank you, Fakhry, for another really helpful presentation and for walking us through a difficult text and making it available and useful again. So that was wonderful, and we'll see you guys next week. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for being such a stimulating, interesting group. It's really very special to be involved with you.
Thank you for also.
Thank you.
Take care. Good night.
Good night. Bye-bye.